George Osborne has recently been told to ditch his controversial Help to Buy scheme as it pushes up house prices. Britons end up spending nearly half of their income on accommodation. Just one of the reasons why a former Treasury advisor says that our economic growth is deceptive. He says that GDP growth is driven by borrowing. Unsurprising, perhaps, when our personal debt rose to nearly £1.5 trillion at the end of last year. And in any case, new spurts of economic growth don't translate into a rise in real earnings, as inflation keeps going up faster than wages. So it's not quite the time to party like 2008 just yet. With me is James Meadway, the former Treasury advisor and senior economist at the New Economic Foundation. Welcome to Going Underground, James. Even Labour admit the economy is in recovery mode. Shouldn't George Osborne do a bit of celebrating?
Well, I think he already is doing a bit of celebrating. I think we've heard no end of celebrations from George Osborne.
Doesn't he deserve it?
Well, that's more of a moot point, I think. The issue you're looking at here is the kind of recovery you've got. You don't have to look very far. Underneath the headline GDP figures, this is a return to growth, GDP rising. You don't have to look very far to start to see all sorts of very, very shaky issues underneath that. One of the most pressing ones remains real wages, and what's happening is how much money people are actually earning after you take account of inflation. Now, on the government's own figures, with their own fairly ropey measure of inflation, real wages have fallen again, particularly if you remove the impact of bonuses, and obviously most people don't get bonuses.
Although with wages we are starting to see weekly earnings catching up, at least with inflation, which is anyway low.
That's where you start to hit the problems. I mean, after a fall of around about 8-9% since 2008, it's the longest fall in real wages for most people, really. I mean, you have to go back a long way, since the 1870s or thereabouts. What you've seen recently is a little bit of a recovery that is almost catching up with the government's preferred measure of inflation, the consumer price index. If you look at the old measure, one that's actually closer to most people's experiences, which is the retail price index, real wage growth is still well below that figure. So most people will still not feel that much better off in real terms when they're looking at their pay packet.
So the way the media are representing the fastest growth in Europe and simultaneously low inflation, and people, some polls showing, Tories, Labour neck and neck, people should realise that their wages, the majority of people's wages are
I think people will realise that. I think the effects you're looking at, I mean, first one, if you're comparing yourself to Europe, you're comparing yourself to a bunch of countries that includes places being absolutely devastated by the crash, by austerity. That's Greece, Spain, Portugal. This isn't a particularly great comparison to use. The second one is that there is, and it's become obvious over the last few years, over the last year, particularly in London, a return to the kind of old early 2000s house price bubble. House goes up in value, you can borrow more money, you feel a bit better off. It doesn't matter so much, you might think, to what happens to your real earnings. Now, the problem you've got there is that this means that people are starting to stack up more and more debt again. And I think that's already starting to happen in quite an alarming way for people who are depending on things like payday lenders, very, very high rates of interest, very, very short-term loans. The figures really bear this out for the last 6 months, 12 months or so.
The debate about the housing bubble is more prevalent, perhaps, in the mainstream media. But then, what are the structural problems that we haven't got away with since Lehman Brothers went bust?
Well, the structural problem is one that's been really striking in the case of the UK. It's happened everywhere across the developed world, but this blow to productivity growth in particular, what you need if you wanted to deliver a sustained increase in growth, one that turns into most people feeling better off and actually being better off, is continual increases in productivity and the efficiency of the economy.
Politicians always say, but that was to do with the artificial rise in productivity created by the internet.
You can sort of, yes, and now we're sort of back to where we should be in this sort of thing. Well, you can argue there are all sorts of peculiar impacts during the 2000s, during this period of apparent increases in productivity. What's happened very strikingly to the figures since 2008 is productivity in this country has dropped and continued to drop. It hasn't recovered. Everywhere else it's really picked up. Here there might be the first signs of recovery. What's very, very striking is we've had kind of a recovery, in George Osborne's phrase, that's produced any number of jobs. This is true, jobs are being created. But because productivity is not recovering, these are low-paid jobs in the worst-paying sectors of the economy. So you're talking about 80% of jobs created are in parts of the economy that don't pay very much. So retail, hotels, nursing homes, these are the sort of very, very insecure, low-paid, often service sector jobs that are being created now.
But not a week goes by in Parliament without, certainly on the Tory benches, some on the Lib Dem benches, the coalition saying manufacturing is on the rise at last.
After taking a hit for 20, 30 years, you're now looking at manufacturing sector.
Is it?
That's about 10% of the whole economy. So any recovery you get from this point, and it's appearing in fits and starts in certain bits of manufacturing, not others. Automotive is one that's recovered quite a bit over the last year. Things like chemicals, very, very much less so. So it's an uneven picture at best within that. So they'll talk it up, but if you're talking about a serious rebalancing of the economy, this just isn't happening. The service sector now is bigger than it was prior to the crash. So for a government that talks about a march of the makers, the manufacturing renaissance, all sorts of other little phrases they've used, this just hasn't happened for the last few years.
So when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, ironically, it's not a debt, it's not related to debt because many business people can't get the loans. The debt is coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the peculiarities in this is who's getting the lending that's starting to appear. If you're a small business, it remains very, very hard. It's remained very, very difficult to get funding since the crash, since 2008, so with very, very few exceptions. And the government attempts to sort of cajole and pressure the big banks into lending to small businesses really just hasn't produced the sort of returns you want.
And should we believe the politicians when they say that the austerity is necessary to curb the debt?
No, this is just silliness. I mean, the figures bear this out. George Osborne has borrowed more in his time in office, about £430 billion of extra borrowing. In his short time in office,
so why are they cutting social spending?
Well, this is more than Labour managed to borrow in 13 years during their time in office. They borrowed £420 billion, £9 billion.
So what's the point of the austerity? Just a kind of punitive thing for the poor?
It's not quite a punitive thing. I think the real drive here is that this is determined by politics. This is determined by political economy. So the net effect of austerity is that you're saying, look, we're not going to care too much about some social impacts over here. We're not going to care about the economic impacts, and austerity undoubtedly is a drag on the economy. The rest of the economy has to work to overcome that. So that's sort of what we're seeing now. So you don't really care about that. What austerity means is you privilege people who hold debt, who are creditors, above everybody else. So it's an ideal policy if at the back of your mind there's a sense that the way this whole economy is structured, the leading end of it is this kind of financialised capitalism. And it means that people who hold debt, who create debt, are the ones who always get privilege. So there's a political drive that lurks behind this.
And Treasury officials and civil servants just shuffle around their offices going, that's the way it is.
Well, I think there's a very broad agreement on the basic frames of the debate here, and there has been for some period of time.
Okay, so what are the dangers?
The dangers
that lie beneath all of this?
Well, I think the dangers are over the long term, this cannot be a sustainable recovery. It is simply not possible to run an entire economy with basically stagnant or falling real incomes and at the same time expecting people to pile up more and more debt.
Even with GDP growth?
With GDP growth, unless that turns into people actually having more money, and unless it turns into things like firms investing, which is just barely maybe starting to happen, this is not sustainable. The hinge of this is investment. If investment picks up very, very substantially over the next few months, perhaps the whole recovery will start to look more sustainable.
Why would it?
Well, there is
because
that.
of the GDP growth figures.
Yeah, of course. And you might have firms feeling more confident. They might start to think, we can probably take a punt on a few large investments here. The trouble you've got in Britain, of course, is that investment relative to comparable countries, right, relative to other developed economies, is historically very, very low, and it's fallen still further since the crash. So there's an awful long way you have to go before you can really start saying, good, this is like embedding productivity increases, it's embedding new technology, it's creating new jobs. We have a very, very long way to go. We might perhaps be at the very, very start of that point in time, but you're not really seeing much evidence of it yet. So this isn't sustainable. It can't be sustainable over the long term. The question then becomes, do you have a sudden stop? Does it crash? Or does it deflate gradually? Again, it's open to debate about quite how that one plays out. If the housing bubble continues, you might start to see a real sensitivity developing around just the sheer scale of debt and borrowing that's built up, especially in London.
James Meadway, thank you.
That's right.